Arlington National Cemetery closes at 5 p.m. The tourists leave. The mourners dry their tears and walk back to their cars. The flags stop their ceremonial folding. Silence falls over 400 acres of white marble headstones. But one man stays. Walter Reed has been the night caretaker of Arlington for 50 years. He started in 1976, a 26-year-old veteran with haunted eyes and a resume that raised no questions. Groundskeeper. Simple work. Quiet work. Perfect for a man who didn't want to talk. The other staff called him the Ghost. Not because he was scary, but because he moved through the cemetery like he belonged to it. Like he was already half buried there himself. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Soldier Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Every night at exactly 3 a.m. Walter did the same thing. He walked from his small caretaker's cottage to the far eastern edge of Section 60. He stopped at a patch of grass that looked like every other patch of grass. No headstone. No marker. No flag. He stood there for exactly 10 minutes. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he just breathed. Then he walked back. For 50 years. Nobody asked why. The few who noticed assumed he was praying for fallen comrades. Or maybe losing his mind. Old veterans did strange things. Everyone knew that. But Walter Reed wasn't crazy. He was keeping a promise. A promise to a man who, according to every official record in the United States government, had never existed. Sarah Chin was 28 years old and hungry. Not for food, for a story. She was a junior reporter at the Washington Post, stuck writing fluff pieces about holiday parades and charity fundraisers. She wanted something real. Something that mattered. Veterans Day 2026 was her chance. Her editor wanted a heartwarming piece about Arlington Cemetery. Interview a caretaker. Get some quotes about sacrifice. Easy, boring, safe. Sarah wanted more. She arrived at Arlington at 4 p.m., camera ready, notebook open. The PR officer introduced her to Walter Reed, our longest-serving employee, a veteran himself, very dedicated. Walter shook her hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes were somewhere else. Somewhere far away and long ago. "Mr. Reed, thank you for your service," Sarah said. "Can you tell me what it's like to care for this sacred ground?" Walter's answer was rehearsed. He'd given it 100 times. "It's an honor. Every headstone is a story. I make sure they're not forgotten." Sarah nodded, writing. But she noticed something. Walter kept glancing east. Toward Section 60. Toward something she couldn't see. "Is there a particular grave that means something to you?" she asked. Walter's jaw tightened. "They all mean something." "Of course. But is there one you visit? Personally?" Silence. Walter looked at her for the first time. Really looked. His eyes were gray like winter sky, and filled with a pain so old it had fossilized. "Some questions," he said quietly, "don't have answers you can print." Sarah should have let it go. Her editor wanted heartwarming, not mysterious. But that look in Walter's eyes haunted her. She started digging. Walter Reed. Born March 15, 1950 in Oakdale, Tennessee. Enlisted in the Army in 1968. Served in Vietnam. Honorable discharge in 1972. Hired at Arlington in 1976. No wife. No children. No living relatives. No living relatives. Sarah frowned. She pulled up Walter's birth certificate. There it was, Walter James Reed, born to Thomas and Mary Reed. But there was something else. A second birth certificate, same date, same parents. William Thomas Reed. Twins. Sarah searched for William Reed. Nothing. No military record. No social security number. No death certificate. No marriage license. Nothing. It was like William Reed had never existed. But he had. He was born. He had a name. He had a twin brother who was still alive. Where was William Reed? Sarah called the National Archives. She called the Army Personnel Office. She called the Social Security Administration. Every answer was the same, no record of that individual. People don't just disappear. Not in America. Not with a paper trail that includes a birth certificate. Unless someone made them disappear. Sarah's heart beat faster. This wasn't a heartwarming story anymore. This was something else entirely. Sarah went back to Arlington. She waited until closing time, then parked her car on a side road and walked through the shadows to the caretaker's cottage. She knocked. Walter opened the door. He didn't look surprised. "You found him," he said. It wasn't a question. "William Reed," Sarah said. "Your twin brother. He's not in any database. It's like he was erased." Walter stepped aside. "Come in." The cottage was Spartan. A bed. A desk. A photo on the wall. Two identical young men in army uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. That's the last picture, Walter said. April 1974. 2 weeks before he died. How did he die? Where is he buried? Walter sat down heavily. He was 76 years old, and for the first time he looked at. William was special, he began. Same face as me, same voice, same fingerprints. We were identical in every way. The CIA recruited him in 1970. They said our biology was an asset. They could send him places I couldn't go. He could be a ghost. What kind of places? The kind that don't exist. Operations that never happened. Countries we were never in. Walter's voice was hollow. They called it Ghost Protocol. If he was captured, there was no rescue. No negotiation. He would simply not exist. And neither would the mission. Sarah felt cold. What happened in April 1974? Walter closed his eyes. Laos. A mission to extract a defector. Something went wrong. William was killed. But because he officially didn't exist, there was no body returned. No funeral. No flag. No letter to our parents. So where is he? Walter looked out the window toward Section 60. I brought him home myself. Walter told her everything. After William's death, the CIA gave Walter a choice. Accept a settlement, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and forget he ever had a brother. Or face charges for unauthorized knowledge of classified operations. Walter took the money. He signed the papers. But he didn't forget. He spent 2 years tracking down William's remains. He bribed contacts in Laos. He called in favors from veterans who had served in the Shadow Wars. Finally, in 1976, a package arrived at his door. A small box. Human remains. And a note, your brother. Don't ask how. Walter couldn't bury William in a real cemetery. There was no death certificate. No proof he had ever lived. Any official burial would trigger questions, investigations, maybe prison for Walter. So Walter did the only thing he could. He got a job at Arlington. Groundskeeper. Night shift. And one night, in the darkness, he dug a hole in Section 60, in a spot between two marked graves where the grass was thick and no one would notice. He buried his brother with his own hands. No headstone. No marker. No record. Just a patch of grass that Walter visited every night for 50 years. I promised him, Walter said, his voice breaking. When we were kids, we promised each other. Whoever died first, the other would be there. Every day. Until we were together again. Sarah was crying. She didn't realize it until a tear dropped onto her notebook. Why are you telling me this now? She whispered. Walter smiled. A sad, tired smile. Because I'm dying. Cancer. 3 months, maybe less. And when I'm gone, no one will know William ever existed. No one will visit him. He'll be alone again. He looked at Sarah. I need someone to remember him. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in her apartment, staring at her notes, wrestling with what to do. If she published this story, she would expose a secret burial in a national cemetery. Walter could face charges, desecration, fraud, violation of his NDA. The government could exhume William's remains. The quiet dignity of Walter's 50-year vigil would be destroyed. But if she didn't publish, William Reed would vanish forever. No one would know about the soldier who gave everything, including his own existence, for his country. She made a decision. She didn't publish the story. Not yet. Instead, she made phone calls. She called senators. She called veterans organizations. She called a lawyer who specialized in military justice. She told them about William Reed, the soldier who didn't exist. The ghost who died for America and was buried in secret by the only person who loved him. One senator listened. A Vietnam veteran himself. He made calls of his own. 3 weeks later, Sarah got a phone call. Miss Chin? This is the Department of Defense. We need to talk about Operation Ghost Twin. The meeting was in a windowless room in the Pentagon. 3 men in suits. A woman in a military uniform with stars on her shoulders. They showed Sarah a file. Declassified that morning. Operation Ghost Twin, 1970 to 1975. A program that used identical twins as deniable assets in covert operations. 7 pairs recruited. 11 operatives killed. All deaths unacknowledged. All records destroyed. Until now. We're prepared to officially recognize William Reed's service, the general said. Posthumous Bronze Star. Full military honors. A proper headstone in Arlington. Sarah felt relief wash over her. What about Walter? He buried his brother illegally. He violated his NDA. The general exchanged looks with the suits. Mr. Reed's actions were irregular, but given the circumstances and his 50 years of faithful service, we're prepared to offer clemency. No charges. On one condition. What condition? He attends the ceremony. He lets us make this right. Publicly. The ceremony was held on a cold December morning. Section 60 was closed to the public. A small crowd gathered. Military officials, the senator, Sarah, a few journalists carefully selected for the occasion. And Walter. He stood in his old army dress uniform, the one he hadn't worn in 50 years. It was too big now, he had shrunk with age and illness, but he wore it anyway. For William. A Marine honor guard carried a flag-draped coffin. Inside were William's remains, officially exhumed and officially reinterred. For the first time in 52 years, William Reed was a real person again. The chaplain spoke. The general spoke. The senator spoke. Then it was Walter's turn. He walked to the podium slowly, leaning on a cane. He looked at the headstone, a real headstone now, white marble with William's name, rank and dates carved into it. His voice was barely a whisper, but the microphone carried it. When we were 7 years old, William broke his arm falling out of a tree. I felt the pain. That's what it was like being his twin. Everything he felt, I felt. When he was happy, I was happy. When he was scared, I was scared. Walter paused. When he died, I felt that too. I felt him leave. I've been feeling that empty space for 52 years. He touched the headstone. They told me to forget him. They told me he never existed. But I couldn't forget. How do you forget half of yourself? He turned to the crowd. William didn't die for glory. He didn't die for medals. He died in a jungle, alone, on a mission that never happened, for a country that would never say thank you. And he knew that when he signed up. He accepted it. Walter's eyes glistened. The only thing he asked me was, "Don't let me disappear, Walt. Promise me. Don't let me disappear." He looked at the headstone again. I kept my promise, brother. You're home now. You're real. And I'll see you soon. The ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. But Walter stayed. Sarah walked over to him. He was sitting in a folding chair, staring at the new headstone. "How do you feel?" she asked. Walter smiled. "Lighter. Like I've been carrying a weight for 50 years, and someone finally helped me set it down." "What will you do now?" Walter laughed softly. "Now, I'll do what I've always done. I'll visit him. Every night at 3 a.m. Just like always. Even now that he has a headstone? Especially now." Walter's eyes crinkled. "Now I can finally introduce him to people. This is my brother William. He was a hero. Let me tell you about him." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Thank you for trusting me with this story." Walter looked at her seriously. "Thank you for not giving up on him. Most people would have walked away. You didn't." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph, the one from his cottage wall. The two young men in uniform. "Keep this," he said. "Show people. Tell them there are thousands of Williams out there. Soldiers who never came home, never got recognized, never existed on paper. But they were real. They mattered." Sarah took the photograph. "I will. I promise." Walter Reed died on February 15, 2027. He was 76 years old. Per his request, he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, in a plot directly adjacent to his brother. For the first time in 52 years, the Reed twins were side by side again. Sarah Chin published her story 3 months later. It wasn't a heartwarming Veterans Day fluff piece. It was a Pulitzer-nominated investigation into Operation Ghost Twin and the forgotten soldiers of America's shadow wars. The story sparked a congressional inquiry. Over the next 2 years, 43 ghost soldiers were officially recognized and honored. Families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their sons and brothers finally got answers. A memorial plaque was added to Section 60. For those who served in silence, died in shadow, and were erased from history. You are not forgotten. You never were. Every year on December 15th, the anniversary of William's recognition ceremony, visitors leave flowers at the Reed brothers' graves. Some are veterans. Some are families of ghost soldiers. Some are just people who read Sarah's story and wanted to pay respects. And some nights, the security guards say if you walk through Section 60 at 3 a.m., you can hear something. Not footsteps. Not words. Music. A harmonica playing an old folk song. The same song Walter used to play for William when they were boys. They say it's just the wind. But the guards know better. The ghost of Arlington is still keeping his promise. Moral of the story: Some bonds are stronger than death, stronger than time, stronger than any government that tries to erase them. Love doesn't need official records. It just needs someone willing to remember. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Soldier Stories and share it with someone who needs to hear it. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds between those who serve. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.